Well, welcome to Conversations, where today we are going to be talking about complex change and how leaders can hold that complexity through the lens of curiosity as a way of being. Today, we welcome in Julie Jenkins and returning guest, Dr. Thomas Anderson II. Both are experts in their field of organizational development and change. It's good to see you both. Welcome, welcome. How are you both today, and where are you coming from?
Sure, so I'll get us started. Good
Yes.
morning. In my part of the world, I am coming in from Calgary, Alberta, Canada. It's so wonderful to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, welcome.
Yes, I am coming from Germantown, Maryland, and thank you for having me as well, Dr. Ray.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, we're going to be talking about complex change and the leader's role and the work that you're doing. I would first love for you to tell our listeners how you met. Who'd like to
Oh,
tackle
yes.
that?
I, well, since it was, since I initiated it, I will tackle that. I reached out to Julie after having read her master's thesis on coaching cultures. And it was such a great read. It was so full of insights that, I reached out as I do, Dr. Whalen. As you well know, with the cold emails. And, Julie responded, and rest is history.
And I love how it's okay to do that. When you and I think more people need to do that. Like if you're reading something on LinkedIn or wherever you see something that you're like, wow, that is exciting, and I'm really interested in about that. People, I think most people would find that that's kind of fun. Was it fun for you? Was it interesting, Julie?
It was really flattering, honestly. I thought, because going into a master's thesis, I was told nobody's going to read this, and you're going to find maybe one or two people who find this at all interesting for their scope of work. And then so to get an email from Thomas to be like, hey, I saw this and I actually read it, and can we meet? I was like, oh my goodness, like I was so flattered. I
Yes.
thought that was amazing, and it's been such a wonderful connection.
Yes. Well, I'm looking forward to the work that I know that the two of you are going to be bringing forward. And I'd love to, we're going to be talking about complex change and the leader's role. But I would first like, is there a difference between, we hear about, within organizations, there's change and complex change. So maybe can you help the listeners identify what complex change may be and how it's different than just a regular change effort?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I often think about change on sort of a spectrum between transactional, transformational, and that's how I've really thought about it sort of my whole career. The transactional being very straightforward, there's a stepwise process to follow things. Transformational sort of being on that side of we don't really know where we're going sometimes, but we know where we are right now isn't where we need to be or where we want to be. And so then how do we move in something that feels more aligned to our vision, our strategy, our outcomes, our clients, our partners? Complex change in my mind sort of takes that a little bit further in the sense that complexity means that there's so many things happening all at the same time that there's no way to sort of sense make. And so all the time we're trying to figure out what's the best decision, where do we go next? And really only in retrospect can we see if the decisions that we made in real time got us to the outcomes that we were looking for. And so often that I find that, at least in the spaces that I sit, I work in education, higher ed, that there's this real need to start to think of things in the change space is quite linear. What's step one, step two, step three? Complex change sort of turns that on its head because there is no steps. There is no right way. There's no, this is the next thing that we do. There's only like, can we make sense of what's happening in the environment and make a best guess or an estimate and then really spend some time learning? And it's through that complexity that we have to sense make, go out into our environment, and then come back and make it as best an educated guess as we can as to around what is our next step. But we're never going to know until we sort of sit and look in the rearview mirror and say, oh yeah, that was the thing that really helped move us forward, or oh gosh, that was a lot of learning. That didn't feel really good, but here's what we can do because of that moving forward.
Thank you for that. Dr. Anderson, do you want to add anything to that?
No, I think that was a very articulate response. I think yes, the only thing that I would add, and it's not an addition, it's more underscoring the fact that answers, a lot of answers are not available in complex change. You can't always understand or articulate why when you go into it, but maybe it's a gut feeling. But yes, all of that,
Yes,
all of what
all of
Julie
that.
said. Yeah.
Excellent. And what, towards the end that Julie was talking about, really the reflection piece and how important for leaders, to look back, or the team to look back, the organization to look back and see, what was important for us to learn from that complex change, I think is crucial. And many times it's a misstep for leaders
Yes.
to sit in
Yes.
that. Yes. Well, Julie, you wrote a post on LinkedIn pondering what is the role of leadership when everyone is holding their breath, waiting for the next wave of change. I'd love to hear what prompted this for you.
Yes. So I work in organizational development, like I said, in higher education. And within the Canadian post-secondary higher ed space, the federal government came down last summer and made some pretty big sweeping changes to international students and their ability to study in Canada. And these changes have had far-reaching implications across all provinces of the country. And so, working in this space, what I have continually seen since last summer is like just everybody waiting, right? It's like we're going to wait for the next set of updates from the government. We're going to wait for the next set of decisions by our senior leaders. We're going to wait for what, the province decides to do, similar to states in the United States. Like, what is our province going to do in response to what the federal government has done? And so every conversation that I was going into, it just felt like, well, when things get stable, when the next wave of change comes, when we get some more information, and it felt like that we were just constantly waiting for this next something, whatever that something was, to feel like we could move forward. And yet I just observed that everybody was holding their breath. And it was like we're just holding, waiting. And in change, that doesn't really happen all too well. Because I don't think stability is a thing anymore. I think that there's a real shift that we're going to have to start contemplating around. Instead of trying to figure out how do we get to that next stable place, what can we do in the here and now? And what are those skills or those ways that leaders can show up that provides a sense of stability in this moment, but doesn't necessarily mean that we're waiting for the next thing. And so what prompted this post was just me observing in my environment the conversations I was having with leaders around everybody just be like white knuckling it, like we're almost there. And then the next email would land or the next news update would come. And everybody's like, oh God, like, and so it was just like the perpetual, like riding these like very tumultuous waves. And it begs the question, at least in my mind, like what else can we do if we sort of accept that this is not going to change and that stability is not maybe something that is going to come in the same ways that we've seen it prior.
Yeah. And Thomas, when I think about leaders, many times instinctively they're fixers, they're problem solvers. So maybe when you think about that, how important is it, like what Julie was saying, with the communication with your people when you're
Yes,
going
that's
through
a good
complex
question.
change?
Yeah, and when Julie brought up waiting, I thought, and I made a little note here about active waiting and inactive waiting.
Mm.
And holding our breath is more of a type of inactive waiting. And I think the role of the leader would be to, number one, detect that, if not just with their people, and this is central to our work with themselves, with that self-awareness piece, to realize that people are holding their breath. Am I holding mine too? Am I anxious? What is going on for me? But then so that's the inactivity. Just I don't know what's going to happen. Things are uncertain. But then once you breathe out, what happens? And for a leader, I think it can be powerful. You know what? The words of Warner Burke, he said a leader's role is to elicit the foresight that is in the organization, is within the team. And so a leader can move from the inactive waiting and even move their people from the inactive waiting to that activity of, okay, let me shift my role a little bit. Maybe I don't have control, but maybe I don't have control of what's going on the outside. What do I have control over that's going on the inside, and then the extension to my team?
And it sounds like a wonderful coaching opportunity for both individuals and teams. What say you?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Helping the individual leader, like you said, actually question and have that self-awareness, and for them to then get curious about, if I'm feeling this way and if I'm exhibiting this, then what is my team feeling and exhibiting?
Yeah, I recently heard the expression that leaders create the weather. And I loved this idea of, how we're showing up, what we're doing, what we're not doing. Are we waiting and how are we waiting? Is it active waiting? Is it not? Like that is projected onto our teams in some ways. And so recognizing that in ourselves, I think really is the first step in getting curious about that. Like, oh gosh, like I feel that. I feel that tension in my chest. I feel like my stomach knotting up. Like, oh, I got to go into this next meeting and I don't know how I feel about like that curiosity and that place of starting to sort of make sense of that is a really beautiful place to start before we even get into our teams because our teams are going to pick up on that. What's said, what's not said, how we show up, are we hurried? Are we avoiding questions? Like, are we leaning in? Are we inviting dissent? Like all of those things, I think really set the tone for how we can show up as leaders in these complex spaces. And it really, like, I so appreciate what you said, Thomas, too, around it starts with us. It comes back to us and sort of starting with our own sense of what's going on here before then I go out there.
Yes. Yeah. And so maybe to continue on that, the leader's style, like how is the leader's style going to impact maybe not necessarily the outcome, but the journey of the complex change?
Yeah, so I have to stop myself from going into theory, as you
Yeah.
well know. Yes, I will. Um, but when we talk about a leader's style, and we talk about it within the bounds of the framework that we have emerging here, we have a controlling style and we have a curious style, just to simplify it a little bit. And so the controlling style is dictating, it's telling people what to do. A curious style is sitting with the discomfort of not knowing. The curious style is also maybe journaling about some things that's could cause anxiety, some things that are making knots in their stomach, or a lot of times these things happen at 2 o'clock in the morning
Mm.
and the leader's up. So that's the best time to figure out what has me awake when the rest of my neighborhood is sleeping. And for my neighborhood, I can look around sometimes, at 2 o'clock in the morning. Maybe there are one or two lights on. That's just the entrepreneurial life or the life of a leader. But in the quiet moments, what's going on with me? And so that all impacts the style. I was on a call with a consultant from New Zealand the other day, and he was telling me about I'm getting his ideas about this coaching tool that I've come up with, and I've been using it for 20 years, and I'm just getting out there. He said, I asked him, I said, well, who would this not work well for? And he told me, well, probably the high powered lawyer, the person who has it all together, the person who has all their steps. So for me, and not to, put a type on it, but just the person, I think of a type A person who's driven, who always has the answers, who always is expected to have the answers. That person is going to show up differently, and it may be harder for them to adopt a different style altogether, but there are some things that can be done, like just open questioning, just asking people questions that don't have a yes or no answer, that can bridge the gap between that controlling style and that curious style.
Yeah, and I'd add to that too that we all sort of have these default spaces that have served us in some ways. We come into leadership positions, and we bring with us sort of our life, right? Like there's life behind us. Even if I think about my own leadership journey, there have been those experiences where I still think about them today and they happened 20 years ago. And I say, under no circumstances am I going to do that thing again. And so then I flip to the other side. And then there's things where I'm like, oh gosh, that was so good. I'm going to do that again because I liked it. But at some point, whether it's good or bad, or it adds or it detracts, there's also sort of this idea of default. So we're coming into these default spaces, and we might not even know that we're defaulting in some ways. And so for me, I also think about, how do we move from that controlling into that curious, is also to really spend some time thinking about what are the defaults that I'm bringing into this, right? I think that's why reflection is so important, is because we can sort of surface, oh, that was that thing, or there's that pattern again of us doing that thing again, or that's sort of how I show up. Oh, that's interesting. And to use it not necessarily as a tool to sort of shame or berate or, put us through our own, be our own worst enemies in many ways, but to use that as a way to say, huh, that's interesting. Do I like that? Does that serve me? And, when we can move, I like to call it, when we move from default to design, when we understand what that default is, then we can move into choice around what we want to design. And that in of itself, in my mind, is also a curious act. So how do we get curious around those things so that we can sort of identify how we might be showing up? What is the cost of that? Is that serving us? Many of the things that we have serve us because they've gotten us to where we are today, and that's not bad. Is it going to serve us moving forward? And I think in change, that's the conversation we need to have with ourselves sometimes as we think about how do we lead in these very complex change times that, are constantly changing.
Yeah. So maybe what are some more leadership attributes, or what leaders really need to be looking at if they're going to be leading through complex change?
So I'm happy to start. There's a few that come to mind. Megan Reese out of the UK, she talks about this idea of spaciousness and how do we create opportunities for spaciousness. And I think that can be uncomfortable, especially if we're so used to defaulting to this fixed command control, take the reins, take charge. I think that's a really beautiful one. I think another sort of skill, or I'm not sure if it's a trait, but a skill that we can lean into is, and this, I heard this for the first time out of Michael Bungay Steiner's work around how do we ask one more question.
Mm.
So instead of us feeling like we need to jump in, right? We got the answer. I've got the advice. I've got this. How do we just, maybe pause and ask one more open question? And then, I think, not to put too fine a point on the piece of curiosity, I think there is that, that space when we feel something, and not to dismiss it or to override it, but to just sit with that maybe a few seconds longer and get curious as to what is that as we head into these conversations, into these decisions, which, are hard. They're very hard sometimes. How about you, Thomas?
Yeah, yeah, thanks, Julie. I'm just sitting here bursting, thinking about different things. And I don't want to go back too far, but to keep it on point, I'm just thinking about like something very practical that somebody who's just stuck in those wear patterns of life or those cycles, just to break the cycle,
Mm.
take a different way home. I
Yeah.
live in the DC area, and
Cool.
Washington DC's traffic, I live right outside of Washington DC. Our traffic is horrendous. It's well known. But sometimes I will get off of the highway and I'll ride through the countryside, which is it only takes maybe 5 more minutes to get home. But the amount of energy I have when I get there and the type of energy I have when I get there is totally different.
You're not
It
clutching the steering
yeah,
wheel.
exactly. And I'm able to move into creative spaces, or just that spaciousness. I like that, and I actually wrote it down. Yeah. So yeah, that would be one major thing. Another thing is just mapping things out. I've found that it helps me, it helps my clients, just to, you may not know everything, but it may help to see what you don't know. But if you don't get it out in some kind of way, if you don't express it, and some people are more talkers, other people are more introspective and like to write. But if you don't get it out, it's hard to know what you do know versus what you don't know, what you have control over versus what you don't have control over. It helps to just map those factors and see where you are.
Yeah, so we've heard a lot about the things that leaders can be doing to help with complex change. If I have a leader who's tuning into this and they're not recognizing maybe the harmful side, what might some of that harmful behaviors or how they're looking at complex change, what might that leader look like?
I can start. This is one scenario. That leader may look like the leader who's rushing in and telling people what to do, but it could also look like a leader who's convincing and persuading people that this is the right thing to do and not picking up on the resistance. I always say when it comes to change that resistance and readiness are two sides of the same coin. And it really goes, it goes back to the person that you're talking to or the group or the stakeholders. Just looking at that and being honest about what's happening.
Julie, do you have anything to add there?
Yeah, I really appreciate that question because I think it sort of flips it on its head, all the things that we can do, but maybe some of the things that we're doing that we might not even be paying attention to, or the ways that we're showing up that are creating more harm. I think one of the things that I think about too in this space is, and I'll give you an example of this because I see this a lot and it's something that sort of irks me, but then I also appreciate why. Like I can understand why people do this. So I heard a story recently about a senior leader who had gotten some intel from an engagement survey that indicated that there was a real discrepancy between how people felt like they were being supported, included, the level of transparency, and some pretty big changes. And they decided that the best solution for this was going to be that every leader in the organization was going to need to meet with their team for 60 minutes a week. And this was going to be the solution for everybody. And I was sort of taken aback because I think what tends to happen, and I use this example because it's so salient for me right now, but I think there's this real tendency sometimes to try and find simple solutions for complex situations. And my caution would be that if, as a leader, you're saying we're just going to do this, and it becomes sort of like the blanket statement that everybody needs to follow, that too can lead to some pretty adverse outcomes. At least from my lens and my backgrounds in organizational psychology, it sort of erodes everything that takes so long to create: trust, engagement, organizational citizenship behaviors, the going above and beyond, the community building. And so I guess what I would love to just sort of communicate is that if you find yourself being like, well, this is the answer, and not going and getting some additional intel or going out and finding people to sort of either provide, intel that this works or that this makes sense, or, maybe we need to think about some other things. That to me would be a big thing to be paying attention to in ourselves, to say like, oh, have I slipped too far into the simple solution for a complex problem? Because I love what you said, Thomas, around resistance being the other side of readiness. I also think we've got sort of these two spaces. We can get compliance and people will comply, power structures within organizations sort of make that happen, but you're never going to get commitment. And it's the commitment long term that helps to create the type of organizations that we want. Coming in with simple solutions, in my mind, is a form of compliance. And so how do we sort of expand that out to think a little bit more broadly so that we can, yes, it might take a little bit more time on the upfront, but how do we go slow to go fast so that we can create that commitment long term, and to see the things that we ultimately want for organizations or people and ourselves as leaders.
And even, I find it interesting because sure, we can meet with our team for an hour a week, and I'm all for teams getting together, but what is happening within that hour? And is the leader able to coach the team? So there's so many things that are within that. So like you said, being compliant. Okay, well, I'm going to meet with my team because I've been told this is what we're doing. But then it has to go beyond that.
Yeah.
Yeah. And if I could add this, I think the 60 minutes or, a period of time in the right circumstances could be helpful. But when change is upon you, when it's knocking down your door, I don't know that that's helpful. And so it brings me to my point. It helps to start earlier when it comes to change. Foresight is best elicited, is best drawn out early. Those early warning signals out on the horizon that are a year off, 2 years off, even sometimes 3 months off can make a big difference. But if we're talking about we need to change yesterday, then that means foresight is not doing its job. And if it's the leader's job to elicit the foresight, I'll leave it up to your imagination what's happening and what's not happening as far as the leader's role is concerned. And I'm not blaming the leader. I'm saying that this is imperative in this environment that leaders add that, just drawing the foresight out of the team, because it's impossible for one person to know everything and to see everything that's going on.
And looking at what are those external factors, right? It's not just about what's internal. Like you said, looking out at the horizon for sure.
Yeah, 100%.
What else before we close would be important for you to communicate?
When it comes to sense making, Julie, you mentioned sense making earlier, and I want to bring it full circle because it is at the early stages of change. It's almost impossible to help people make sense of something you don't yet understand.
Mm-hmm.
But when leaders go through, do the work to, just pick up on what's going on, the people, and you'd be surprised, if you're a first-time leader, I tell first-time leaders this, how much people are just scanning the horizon, picking up on what's going on, reading not newspaper. Well, some people do still read the newspaper. More people are reading, what's going on online. But, all this information, we're intaking information every day. And so the answers are in the room. The leader's job is really to pick up on that collective wisdom. The wisdom is there. It's just a matter of pulling it out and figuring out what to do with it. And then, that adds the granularity to the picture. The change vision, it's out in front. That adds the granularity. And then a leader can more easily help people to make sense of what's going on.
Mm-hmm. And I would add to that too, is, once you have spent time gathering that wisdom in the room, it's giving yourself and others the grace to say, we're going to try. And it's not going to be perfect. And, this commitment that we're going to make, we're going to come back in 3 months and we're going to see, did that get us where we wanted to be? I often find that leaders have really good intentions. And then it's like, we're going to do this. And then it falls off when it comes to the impact. And I think it's a function of a lot of things, but at least in my world, it's just like the next thing, we got to keep moving. And so there's never really any time to sort of spend understanding what was the impact. The intention is usually pretty good, right? We want to keep our businesses moving. We want to keep our people good. We want to be okay. There's good intention, and then the impact is where it falls off. And so I think in that sort of sense making at the beginning, it's to give, yourself and everybody else the permission to say, we are going to try this. And there are going to be things that are great that we love. There are going to be things that don't work. It's not a reflection on, whether it was the right or the wrong or the good or the bad. It's more, what are we learning? Okay, that didn't work. Cool. Now, what else can we try? Because our intention is to do X, right? I'll give you an example. Last summer, as part of an opportunity to really connect the OD work that we do into our larger HR function, I sent out an email every Monday. And I was like, here's what's happening in organizational development. Here's the upcoming courses. Here's the upcoming things that you can participate in. We said, gave terrible jokes and sent terrible memes just as a way to sort of have some fun. And so we did that all summer. We started in June and we ended in August. And we went out in September because we had heard nothing all summer. There was not a single reply, not a single mention of this. There was nothing. It was just radio silence. So we went out in September and, asked some people, like, what did you think about it? What did you like it? And predominantly people came back and said it was nice. But that was kind of all the feedback we got. And at that point, I decided, okay, what did we learn? Well, we learned that it's really important to be communicating out what we're doing in this space so people are aware. It's really important. I learned a really valuable lesson about consistency, even when there is no feedback, because that's, a good practice for us to be building. Was it the right way to be connecting with our broader HR team? No. Everybody's busy. It was another email. People were feeling like, if I get to it, that's great. There were some people who were even feeling guilty that they didn't get to it. They were filing it away. But that's okay. We learned. So we stopped that and we've moved on to other ways of experimenting around what can we do to communicate and create a bigger and more cohesive HR team. That's all learning. And so I guess what I would offer in this space is sense make and then try and come at it with just sort of this I think Adam Grant talks about it as sort of like the mindset of a scientist. Like, what can we learn? What's our hypothesis? What can we take away from this? What can we move into our next experiment? And I think that's so valuable in the space of complex change because there is no one right way. There's no step A, phase two, there's nothing that's linear about this. So how do we create experiments, create opportunities to reflect and learn and then integrate what works and to move on and beyond what is holding us back or costing us too much in that moment?
See, when I hear you talking about these wonderful ways that a leader can show up and be for their people, for me, it's like the anxiety goes down. I could just feel, if this was you and you're talking to your team, if they had anxiety, it would be coming down. All those emotions that they have because this is change, I feel that they would be put to rest more. And then people are able to be thinking clearer about what the next step is, or like you said, what the learning is, and things like that. But that takes a leader who is curious and who is intent on learning about not just the change effort, but their people and establishing those relationships.
Yeah, one of the things that I hear myself saying often right now is two things can be true. We can still feel anxious about change and we can find a way forward. Yes, we still might know we don't know what's coming tomorrow, and we can still make a plan. And, in the space of paradox, which really that is, the only way to move through a paradox is acceptance. And so when we can hold two things or more, there's often more things that are true at the same time. I think it does create an opportunity for people to feel like they don't need to be happy about it or sad about it, or they can just be, and then we can figure out a way forward.
That's right. Okay, you two. Well, I'd love to give you the last word. It's been a terrific conversation on complex change and what that looks like and how leaders can show up. And as you said, just be. So what say you, Thomas? We'll start with you and then we'll go to Julie for the last word as well.
Thank you, Dr. Whalen. One thing that is popping up for me to tell leaders is to be kind to yourself. And that is advice I've received from you, Dr. Whalen. And it has not only changed my life, my business, but it's also changed my family. And I tell my daughters, you know what? In being hard on yourself, also be kind to yourself. But so that comes back to the paradox. Two things can be true. Thank you, Julie.
Yes.
Yeah, and I think that's such a beautiful segue to, this idea that I talk about and I hold for myself is remembering that this is hard and this is not easy. And, change by its very nature creates some pretty intense or physiological changes, right? We can't remember things the same way. We can't take on new information the same way. We need to hear things multiple times. And so as leaders, it can be really frustrating sometimes, I think, to try and hold that space for ourselves as leaders and me in this change, and then to also hold that space for me leading a team in this space. And so be kind to yourself, give yourself the opportunity to learn and not to get it right, and to try on vulnerability a little bit more. I really think and believe and have seen in my own leadership practice that the more you invite people in to what's going on, within limits, I understand that there's some things that are confidential, but the more that you can bring people into what's happening with you and what you're thinking about and what you're, wanting to experiment with, what you need some more information on, I think the more people are going to rally to try and make it happen. And the research that I've come across at least shows that the more that a leader is in tune with their team and the greater trust that there is in those relationship spaces, the more willing a team member is going to follow a leader, even if they don't have all the information. And so, at the end of the day, we're all humans trying to have a human experience in very human and complex spaces. So be kind to yourself, extend some compassion to yourself and others. Remember that this is hard and that there are no right answers, and you're doing great. You're doing great.
And you're doing great. That's right.
Well, great.
Thank you so much for joining me on Conversations, Julie and Dr. Thomas Anderson II. Go ahead and we can make sure that people have your LinkedIn. I think we have that. We'll put that in the show notes if people want to connect with you there. I'm looking forward to seeing what you two do in the future around this. And until next time, you two keep doing great things, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.